have two levels of membership for the webinars, which are weekly, and for electronic copies of our publications, plus all previous publications we've done, it's £5 a year, which less than 10 pence a week, which I think we can all agree is a pretty good price. If you want physical copies of the journal and magazine, it's £20 a year. Good evening and welcome. My name's CJ, as you've probably gathered by now, and tonight I'm going to be talking about one of the less exciting methods, but one of the more productive methods that parapsychologists have used to research ghosts over the last 120 years. So tonight's title is Ghosts, S is for Survey. If you haven't seen any of the previous installments, they are Ghosts, R is for Recording, Ghost M is for Mediumship, Ghosts B is for Bones, and Ghost C is for Christmas. And I like to think that some of the theoretical stuff I deal with actually is useful from time to time, but I may well be wrong. Still, if you'd like to see them, they're all free on the YouTube channel. Tonight, I am, as usual, going to be discussing the work of the Society for Psychical Research, which was founded in 1882. It's still going strong today. You'll find it at spr.ac.uk. And we split off from them in 1981. This is not going to be a history lesson, though there may be some history in it. And there may also be some utterly random nonsense, because I rather suspect I'm suffering from COVID. So if I start to become feverish and go to doolally, then I'm sure somebody will jump in and take over. Okay. And, well, why am I going to be talking about the SPR? Well, in August 1889, the International Congress of Experimental Psychology decided to conduct a major study of apparitions. And they were interested at the time in telepathy and which was thought transference. The term telepathy was only coined in 1894. The idea that people could send impressions or send thoughts from one mind to another. And they were also interested in apparitions, that is, ghosts and hauntings. And they wanted to bring science to bear on these age-old problems. Now, France has had a long tradition of what we might call psychical research. In the 18th century, a German called Mesmer had travelled to France, and mesmerism had taken hold and become something of a craze. And mesmerism is one of the predecessors of what we now call hypnotism. I argue that they are very similar indeed. But what hypnotists and mesmerists supposedly achieved in the first century or so of mesmerism and hypnotism was what we would now call paranormal phenomena. That is, ideas like you could read somebody's mind while they were under the influence, or that you could see, they could have visions of things that were occurring a long way away. And spiritualism had also been all the rage, and there had been a number of learned societies founded across the world. But in 1882, the SPR became the preeminent of them all, founded under Henry Sidgwick and others in England. So in 1889, a number of the members, 7 years in, a number of the members travelled to Paris to address the Congress of Experimental Psychology, which is the first major international gathering of psychologists. And what they decide to do is to conduct a massive census of these experiences. And because the experience of seeing a ghost is seeing something that's not actually there, they use the word hallucination, because that's the correct medical term for seeing something that isn't there. Now, this to this day causes offence to some and confusion in many, because we tend to think of hallucinations as, hey man, far out, you know, like, well, I dropped acid on a Saturday night just to see what the fuss was about. And psychedelic research obviously does have implications here. And we can also think of fever dreams as being hallucinations. But the term hallucination is actually much more neutral than that. It doesn't imply drugs or delirium tremens, withdrawal from alcohol, or fever such as COVID. What if I'm hallucinating you all now? Am I actually doing a webinar, or am I laying on my bed with COVID convinced I'm doing the webinar? No. Anyway, we won't worry about that for the moment. But hallucination is a value neutral term, so it doesn't imply anything about mental illness or the influence of chemicals. So they carried out what they called the Census of Hallucinations. Now, just over on the right, you'll see a poster in 1889 in Paris. It started at the end of May, I think, no, 1st of May. They opened the Eiffel Tower. Eiffel himself had his own apartment within it, Gustave Eiffel. There was a dining room, and you could go all the way up, and it was a wonder of the world. I think it was possibly the tallest building in the world at the time it was built. And it was built using prefab construction. And during the period of the Great Exhibition, population of Paris went from 4 million temporarily up to about, well, 20 million people came to stay. And there was huge competition for rooms, etc. And the exposition Universelle had a native village where there were South Americans and African tribes people who were brought in. It was terrible in many ways, actually terrible, some of the things that happened, but it also had technological wonders from around the world and scientific wonders, and different halls which had displays from different nations showing their unique culture and their different technologies. So it was a fascinating time and a fascinating place. And this is the background for the scientific investigation of apparitions to be declared. Okay, so let's go down. So who did it? Well, as you can see, we had Eleanor Sidgwick. She was the wife of Henry Sidgwick, the philosopher. This is her later in life, but she was a Cambridge academic at a time when Cambridge was largely closed to women. And she was a pioneer with her husband, Henry Sidgwick, of women's education. And they opened up Cambridge to women to be able to go and get a university degree and enter the professions. So they absolutely both fought extraordinarily hard for the right of women to be treated like any other student and to get academic qualifications. The next person across is just as radical, Frank Podmore. He was one of the founders of the Fabian Society, him and Edith Nesbit, who wrote 4 children in it or 5 children in it, I can never remember, but she wrote a number of famous children's books. And Frank, his Fabian Society lived beyond him. He died in 1910, but he was one of the progenitors and creators of the British Labour Party, which is a mild, moderate socialist British Democratic Party. So at the time, he was very progressive, as was Mrs. Nesbit and Mrs. Nesbit's husband, who was somewhat inclined to swinging, I think the correct term is nowadays. She not only made all of the money for the family, Mrs. Nesbit, by writing children's books, she also raised all of the children of her husband's mistresses with her own. Frederick Myers, he was a bit of a dirty dog, according to some, but he was handsome, brooding man from Cheltenham. What is it about hat-wearing psychical researchers from Cheltenham? Well, the truth is that Freddie was A, clever, and B, had a beard, so I'm not living up to the reputation. And finally, Alice Johnson. No, she was not actually prone to hit the bottle. She was not pissed as a newt. She was an expert in newts. One thinks of, what's he called? Bertie Thinknottle from P.G. Wodehouse. If only Alice had met Bertie, their lives would have been so happy. Alice was an expert on the newt at a time when zoology was in its infancy. She was one of the great pioneers of British academic zoology. She was at Cambridge University. Mrs. Sidgwick employed her as a university lecturer. She spent her whole life in academia, and she was a first-rate woman scientist who is largely forgotten today. And I struggled really hard to try and find a picture of Alice at any stage in her life. And I wasn't able to find one in any of my sources. I almost went down and went through all my SPR journals in the case there was a photo from sometime in the 1890s. Couldn't find one. So how to pay tribute to Alice Johnson? Well, her great love was newts. She published a number of papers and books on newts. And so here is a crested newt. I hope she would be happy with that. So a bunch of serious academics. Podmore worked for the post office. Myers was a classicist. Mrs. Sidgwick was head of a Cambridge college, and Alice was a zoologist. They would have it would have been run by Edmund Gurney, who the ladies may remember. Please hang on to your hats, ladies. Was the most handsome man in Victorian England, according to most people. but he had died. He had accidentally, while in a Brighton hotel, imbibed chloroform from a bottle by his bed, and the suggestion at the time was that he thought it was lemonade. He had a bottle of lemonade on the other bedside table, and he drank the wrong substance and died as a result. There have been many attempts from 1818, I think it was 1888 or 1889, but from the day that he was found in that hotel to the present day, to try and prove that he committed suicide. But the lack of a transparent motive, no one will ever know. Arthur Myers, Dr. Arthur Myers, was the brother of Frederick. He worked on this census of hallucinations I'm going to talk about. He was a professional tennis player, Wimbledon finalist. Don't think he got as far as final, possibly quarter finalist, but anyway, one of the better professional tennis players of the era. And he suffered from epilepsy. And on his death, his brain was removed, and lesions on his brain that had led to the epilepsy led to a breakthrough in neurology. So Myers' brain is often referenced. Okay. So what was the census of hallucinations? Well, it was a huge report on 1,684 cases of haunting. If you can't prove the existence of ghosts or what a haunting is or what a ghost is from a single report, then with that many, surely we can, if you've got, say you've got COVID, as I may have at the moment, I don't know, don't feel very well, as I said. The symptoms vary wildly. When I first had it in March 2020, 3 years ago, I was flat on my back, absolutely flat on my back for 9 weeks. I hovered back, basically, in a terrible state. And some of my friends, including some of those in their 20s, were dashed to hospital, and one was told to phone his wife and children and say goodbye. And he was in his late 20s, early 30s, I think. It was a rough time. Then the second time I had it, which was a couple of years ago, about a week or two before I had to go to Weird Weekend North, I got over it so fast. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I was going to cancel everything. And it was a completely different disease because the strain was different. And this time I just feel like I've got a mild cold, I suppose. Maybe I have. I don't know. But all of these different diseases are the same phenomena, which we call COVID, but different strains. Are hauntings like that? Are hauntings the same phenomena? And ghosts and hauntings are very much the same thing. It's just they manifest differently at different times to different people. Well, we don't know, but the only way we might find out is if we have enough cases to draw up some guidelines to actually diagnose from, so to speak. And that's what this was an attempt to do. It was an attempt to create an overall understanding scientifically of cases of apparitions, of ghosts appearing. So what if you want to read it today? Well, you've got a couple of options. I'm just going to run through this quickly. First one is, if you're a member of the Society for Psychical Research or various other organisations, unfortunately at the moment, not including ASSAP, but the Rhine Research Centre, the SSE, the Institute IMI, the Parapsychological Association, the EHE, or I'm afraid the European Journal of Parapsychology closed down a few years ago. But you could join one of these organizations, which cost different amounts of money, and that allows you to become a member of LExion for just £18. And what LExion is it's a database, and depending which one you join, you'll have access to different journals. But it's a database for parapsychology, and it gives you access to a huge number of texts. Now, I'm going to assume that most of you don't want to do this, and I'm going to describe another way around it in a moment. But if you do want to do it and you're very serious about your psychical research, lexion.org is well worth looking at. If you do join it and you want to look up the report on the sense of hallucinations, you go to the top and you click the third one across, that bracket there, and that will let you into Lexion, into browsing by different categories. Click on the SPR online library, click on the proceedings for the Society for Psychical Research, and then highlight PSP volume 10, 1894. From 1894, you go to add to results, and ignore all these in a moment, but it will appear over there. And then you can click on it. And if you go to PDF image, because you can also just get plain text or various other ways of looking, you can define an excerpt to download or print off. All of you could do this tonight without paying, because there's a 2-week or so free subscription, but it only gives you a limited access in terms of how many downloads, how many print offs you can do. But you can then pull up the original report from the Census of Hallucinations, which, here's the pricing. So the top pricing is to join the SPR. Their regular membership is £84. That includes print publications, obviously. They don't have an electronic version. Ours is 20. Except ours is joint. So ours is, theirs is 98. Ours is 20. But you can, on your membership of ASSAP, whether it's £5 or £20, you can have somebody else who's living at your address as a joint member. But there's various others, such as concession, donor, regular, parapsychological association members, and so on. And concessionary over 50s or 60s or benefits is £56. If you join the SPR, it's by far the cheapest way, because if you look down here, a standard subscription is £85 to LExion, whereas if you join the SPR, you get the SPR stuff for free, and you can pay £18 to get all of the other stuff that's there. Anyway, those are just the pricing in case you ever did want to do LExion. There are, however, better ways to do it if you don't want to spend all that money. If you have gone to it and you've decided to get a copy, if you go to the proceedings, the report on the census is about 330 pages long. That's not as boring as it sounds, because most of it is cases or analysis of cases. They don't give you 1,684 cases to read, but they discuss the findings and what they think. They tell you about the nature of ghosts, and with each claim they make, they back it up with a series of extracts from real cases that they had handed in. That's what we're going to be doing tonight, hopefully, once I've managed to do this kind of brief background history. And I'm sure for many of you, you're fully aware of all this. It's sort of ghost hunting 101, but just in case. So the census question was, have you ever, when fully awake and unaffected by illness, alcohol, or drugs, had an experience of seeing something or someone, or of hearing a voice when there was no ordinary cause for it that you could find? Have you ever, when fully awake and unaffected by illness, alcohol, or drugs, had an experience of seeing something or someone, or of hearing a voice when there was no ordinary cause for it that you could find? So that was their version of, have you seen a ghost? Does it work? Well, we'll discuss that in a minute. The methodology they used was they sent out collectors with a questionnaire. Here we have a lady with her album. I thought it was a nice picture. It's from a cigar card of the period. And they were asked to approach all individuals within groups, such as an officer or household, and conduct a survey. So the reason that you were asked to get everybody's agreement to do it was so that they could work out roughly a percentage of how many people had the experience and how many hadn't. Of course, they were fully aware that if you just asked people, would you like to do a survey on ghosts, people who believed in ghosts were likely to respond, and people who didn't would not. So hence the decision that they should ask their collectors to do large groups. Methodologically, it was rubbish, but it was an improvement on anything else that was being done at the time. And in fact, the SPR invent a whole load of different social science research methodologies that went on to become known as qualitative research. They were pioneers of social science research methodology. So therefore, they were making it up as they went along. And as a result, sometimes they went a bit, wrong. But we've had 120 years to make things better. Right, the census report, you can see it on the right there from page 25 to page 402, was published, and there are ways you could find out about the results. The presumptions and the principles that underlay their belief, the cases they'd looked at from which had been brought to their attention at the SPR before they wrote the report were published in 2 volumes in 1886 in a book called Phantasms of the Living. That's an unusual title, isn't it? Ghosts are Phantasms of the Living. And that's something we'll be talking about a bit in a while. But firstly, let's move on down. The results, 17,000 people canvassed, of which 1,684 said they'd said yes to the title. And in pub quizzes, ever since 1894, this has been represented as 1 in 10 people have seen a ghost in the UK. That's the figure that's normally given. And that has been given for a century without anyone really questioning it. I suppose that, 9.82% doesn't sound quite as exciting. However, interestingly, the number does not vary very much over the century when other people have done research using the same question. I'll get to that in a minute again. Right. So should you go out and join LExion just so you can read the results of this and learn what we know academically about ghosts? No. The reason is, in 1948, GNM Tyrrell went through all 1,686 cases that were reported. He struck a few off, and because they were dodgy or he didn't think they made sense, and he wrote a book called Apparitions, the classic study of extrasensory perception in relation to ghostly apparitions or ghostly appearances. You can almost certainly get GNM Tyrrell's Apparitions. If you make a note of it now where it's on the screen, and then you Google it, or you go to Play and look up Playbook, is it ebooks? Playbooks, I think it's called. Or you could go onto amazon.co.uk, or you could go to Project Gutenberg. I'm pretty sure it's out of copyright, and I'm fairly certain that it's available free of charge to download. I could be wrong, but usually it will certainly be available in many editions at a very cheap price, probably a couple of quid. It is not the most exciting book I have ever read. It is, in fact, in places slightly misleading. But on the whole, it is a classic, and it is the book to give you a good theoretical base in apparitions. There's an even better one that was written by ASSAP founder Hilary Evans, which are somehow blue tacked rubber books, called Seeing Ghosts. Can you see that? And Seeing Ghosts is superb. It came out in, wasn't that long ago. It was during the ASSAP period. I don't know. It came out a few years back, probably about 2000, I would guess, 2001, 2002, something like that. 2002. And it does exactly the same thing that Tyrrell does in Apparitions, except it has a slightly wider range of cases. Most of them are cases taken from this book. There's another book by Ernest Bevan, which is called something like Hauntings and Apparitions. And what he did was he carried out a radio survey. He asked members of the public to write in if they had seen an apparition and to enclose. And he managed to get some really good cases that way. So these case collections are classics because they do several things for you. Firstly, they allow you to make theoretical judgments about how ghosts may work. Secondly, they let you learn about how people in the past have investigated hauntings on a case-by-case basis. So if you look at the return of Grandfather Bull, for example, you can see the efforts the investigators made to try and understand what was going on. And finally, they'll give you a really good grasp of the theoretical frameworks that have been put forward, even though I think many of them were misinformed. And I find problems with a lot of them. They're still worth reading to understand the framework. In 150 years, we have made progress. We've ruled some options out. The recording hypothesis, I think, is dead. I don't think there's much argument for cyclical ghosts anymore for various reasons. The half-life theory of ghosts doesn't actually, although it's really attractive as an idea, it doesn't actually seem to be supported by the evidence. So what I'm saying here is read the books to get a good grasp of what you're doing before you go out and start, doing apparitional research in the field, so to speak. If you don't like reading, and not everyone does, and I can barely read at all at the moment, before I get to page 17, I've just lost concentration. Another possibility nowadays is you can learn this by just going to ASSAP webinars, because we say the same things week after week, and you will very quickly get a summary of what's been learned. Right, let's move on. Okay, the survey tradition. The survey tradition is the SPR census of hallucination, and then there's a whole load of different studies that use similar methodologies. 1948, 50 years later, Donald West did the mass observation survey. He did exactly the same thing, basically. He asked people to write in with cases in response to that question. McCreary and Green, which is misspelt for some reason as McCreely. I've no idea why. It should be McCreary. Go back. Previous. McCreary and Green, 1974. Celia Green is quite astonishing. She's over at Oxford. Donald West again, his pilot survey in the 1990s, published in the SPR. He talks about the researchers. Hilary Evans, to seeing ghosts. He carried out a small-scale study. Wiseman and Watt did one in 2008, as did Dave Wood, who did one down in Wiltshire. That was an ASSAP one, or in fact, it was done through PSI, his group was called, but it was part of that. He was chair of ASSAP at the time. 2009, the accidental census. How do you do a census by accident? I posted on my Facebook for a laugh the survey question to see if people actually understood it, because Becky was planning a PhD in which she was going to recreate the census. And okay, what happened there was, once I posted it on my Facebook, people replied. And when people replied, we thought, well, what are we going to do with this? So we made a note of what they said and wrote them with follow-up questions. And then Becky bunged it on her Facebook. And then we asked our friends, would you like to put it on your Facebooks? And suddenly we had a couple of hundred responses with people telling us their ghost stories. Now, bearing in mind that we used the archaic Victorian wording, we're really surprised it worked, but it did work. And that's something that we're going to be doing, hopefully tonight or soon, is we're going to create a questionnaire to find cases and to find recent experiences. And we're going to post it on Facebook or in social media or on our own feeds. And we're going to act as collectors and ask our friends to fill in the questionnaire and attempt to get cases, all of us, to see how many new cases and how many experiences. And we're going to record our own experiences in a database so that we can then carry out large-scale research on it. So I'm going to talk more about how we're going to do that later. That's not the fun part of tonight, but that is one of the things we're going to be doing. And finally, Dr. Rebecca Smith. Some of you may have met Becky. She's our treasurer and my girlfriend, as it happens. I met her through, one of these awful hauntings when a candle got chucked across the a room when I was wittering. Probably, as I said at the time, the ghost was frustrated at listening to me prattle on. And from that point onwards, we got to know each other. And I tried to persuade her that she did not want to go out with a parapsychologist. She just wanted to be one. So she went off and did a PhD. And she's still with me 20 years on, 18 years on, but there you go. A Century of Apparitions was her reconstruction or revisiting of the original Census of Hallucinations, where she used the internet to collect. And the interesting bit about it was, in 100 years, you would expect, or 120 years, you would expect apparitions to have changed. You would expect people's idea of what a ghost experience was to have been informed by Hollywood, by the films Paranormal Activity, by The Exorcist, by Poltergeist. You would expect people to basically see ghosts through a framework that was created, a psychosocial framework, which was influenced by the cultural zeitgeist. Were they? Bollocks, were they? No. The experiences, when you break them down, the actual numbers and the basic experiences are very similar. In fact, they're largely, they are statistically identical to the experiences that were recorded by the SPR in 1894. So nothing is changing in primary, in reports of ghost activity. The things that people experience today in first-hand accounts, where the account is given by the person who was the recipient, are the same as things that happened in 1894. Because of that, we are able to draw conclusions. And in fact, it stayed pretty much the same all the way through all these surveys. So what differences are there? Well, one of the biggest differences is that in the original SPR census of hallucinations, most of the ghosts reported were of living people, of people who were alive and well. And that was exactly the same in 1948. It was still a strong thing in 1974. It gets weaker and it's lower than apparitions of the dead by 1990. And by now, we see this people. Now, this is where you can identify who the ghost is. But generally, nowadays, people ascribe the identity of the ghost to be a dead person, not a living person. What do I mean, a living person? Well, let's have a quick look at some more theory. And then we'll do some cases and it'll be much more interesting and I'll shut up. So veridical cases, let's start with this idea. A veridical case is one where information is given to the percipient, the person who sees the ghost, by the apparition that could not have been known at the time by any normal sensory apparatus. So if someone appears to you, your auntie appears to you and she's just dropped dead, by her very appearing at that moment, she is a veridical, assuming that nobody's told you she's dead, that's a veridical experience. A veridical experience is one where you learn and that information is also recorded. So you can't just, have it happen. You need to have written it down or you need to have told other people before you have the confirmation. Whether a case is veridical, the word just means truthful or not, is important because anyone could, let's say I'm walking down a corridor in an old abbey and I'm a bit spooked and I see a ghostly monk. There's me on my own. I see it. It's quite plain to me, but my nerves are already on edge. I'm tired and I ate a heavy meal just before I came out. That's what the Victorians used to say, wasn't it? There's more gravy than of the grave about you. So I just ate my roast beef and I'm walking the thing and suddenly I see this ghostly monk. Is it something that is subjective, that only exists in my own mind, or is it actually an external ghost? A veridical case is one where we have some evidence that, the monk tells me something or shows me where its bones are buried or some similar thing that leads us to believe that it imparted information that could not be known by other means. And in fact, the early ghost researchers usually thought that that was the purpose of apparitions. Apparitions were a way of your brain telling you some information that they had acquired by telepathy. Now, I don't actually think there's that much evidence for that as a hypothesis, but we'll look at it because that was their theory. Got really washed out tonight. Deaf coinstances. Sorry, all these pictures are ones that I just did for the thing. When the apparition coincides with the death of the person appearing. So if your auntie dies and you actually are seen at exactly the same time. By exactly the same time, I've mentioned here, there's a bit of an issue because when is death? I don't know who's here tonight, so I don't know if we have any experts on the subject in the house. But death is slightly contested. Irrevocable brain death or irrevocable end of circulatory and respiratory systems are commonly used. But the exact point at which a body ceases to be alive, unless you're blown to bits or drown, or, there's some very, very obvious physical destruction of the body, usually it's not that easy to tell when someone actually has stopped exactly. So we use before and after death by 12 hours as a criteria. Those are called deaf coinstances. Next type of haunting, let's go to the next one. Crisis apparitions, apparitions of the living. Oh, I don't know why it says crisis apparitions over there. It's a ghostly text has appeared. Some event or danger seems to have occurred that causes the ghost, the person, to the real person. So Mandy's out walking in the woods, something terrible happens. She realizes that she's trapped her foot in a man trap, an old rusty Victorian man trap, can't get free, and suddenly her mother at home baking scones looks up and sees this image of her in the wood in trouble. So she rushes down to the forest and calls out the search party who find her and rescue her. That's a typical crisis apparition. And Experimental apparitions. The sleazy looking dude on the right is, I just chose him because well, maybe he's not sleazy, I don't know. Experimental apparitions were really big in the 1880s and the 1890s in the SPR circles. They almost invariably went something like this. So I, 18-year-old man, Cyril Ponsonby Smythe, decided to conduct an experiment. Remembering that the sisters Fawcett, the three beautiful young 17, 18, and 19-year-old sisters, were in the habit of bathing naked at about this hour, I decided to project into their bedroom and follow them into the bath chamber as an experiment in psychical research. After trying this for 650 days, crikey, it actually worked, and they saw me as an apparition. After they threw the loofah and the soap at me, I said they never wanted to hear from me again. I was so shocked, I wrote this letter. Yours sincerely. I joke, but it was something along those lines. It's invariably a young man who is attempting to project into a young woman's bedroom without warning her to see if she sees his ghost. And some people claim they're good at it and that they will appear, and other people don't. In the event you ever see my ghost in your bedroom, please don't assume that I'm actually doing it as an experimental apparition. Please assume that something terrible has happened to me and I'm in danger of being eaten by my cats. Do come round, do phone someone and send someone round to check that I'm not trapped under a pile of books or something. I'm not really likely to take part in experimental apparitions into young ladies' rooms. I'm too old for that kind of thing. Phantasms of the living, a general term for any apparition where of a person where the reason for appearance is not clear. The 1886 book was called that because they turn out to be the most common kind of apparitions that were seen by the recipients. How are we doing for time, Claire?
You're fine, CJ. We're only 7:45 now.
Oh, okay. So I've only been talking for. Okay, I'll shut up soon. Apparition implies appearance, but the visual sensory modality, that is, hearing or smell or touch, you can have other senses. And one of the most common experiences that you get is you're at home and you hear your partner who's due back from work. They come in, they walk up the stairs, you hear them go to the toilet, they might say hello, and then 20 minutes later they drive up and say, oh, sorry, I'm late, I got stuck in traffic. I don't know if any of you have ever had that experience, but it is apparently quite common. I've certainly known many people who have had the experience, and Becky has many times claimed to have heard my voice and so forth. Anyway, we won't go into detail about it for the moment. We'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, so that was my presentation. I'm going to stop there deliberately because I'm now going to move on to the next part, which involves you doing some exercises. Yes, I'm sure this